So, Richard, you began as an actor, am I right, before turning to directing?
Yes, I'm slightly ashamed to say that I did. Only I visited my performances on a rather... I oppressed the audience with my performances, and I always felt that during the later times that I was acting that I was like Joxer in Juno and the Paycock, when the captain says, I can't bear the sort of fellow who does what he can't do. And it was, for me, a sort of perfect exemplar of the paradoxes involved in acting, because on the one hand, an actor has to be conscious of themselves, but you can't be self-conscious, and you have to know yourself, but not give the impression that you're self-knowing. And you have to show off, you have to exhibit yourself, but you can't be an exhibitionist if you're an actor. So that balance between reason and instinct is a balance that I didn't have. And I came to, when I was feeling confident and naive, I could do it. And the moment I started, my confidence, my self-knowledge started to strengthen and my confidence was eroded, I found it literally impossible to act. I became catatonic. And so I gave it up, and I decided to give it up. And I remember this because it was the day of Churchill's funeral.
1965.
1965, I think it was in January, and I was in a production of The Boyfriend, a musical which it's not the musical's fault, but I hated every second of it. I just looked in the mirror and thought, enough, I'm giving this up. I persuaded the person who directed the production and was running the theatre to allow me to direct a Sunday night production of a play by Angelico called The Knack, which is a wonderful play, 5 actors. And I asked 5 actors in the company if they would appear in it. And they said yes. We put it on for a Sunday night. And the director of the theatre after that said to me, you have to make a choice. Do you want to be an actor or do you want to be a director? And I never believed that this was, that a choice was available to me. I said, well, I think a director, because I don't think I'm very good as an actor. So he then took me on as a director. But one wonderful thing happened that night is that the director, John Neville, who was running Nottingham Playhouse, came to see the play because he was with Judi Dench.
In Hamlet?
No, he wasn't in Hamlet. He was running Nottingham Playhouse. Judy was appearing there, and John and Judy wanted an opportunity to get away from Nottingham. So he brought her to this production of The Knack, and that's when I first met Judi.
This is such an amazing sort of serendipitous thing.
And that's when I became a director.
No, but he did play Hamlet to her.
He did play Hamlet to her Ophelia at the Old Vic.
Excellent. Yep. So once you did move into running theatres, and I know you were at the Lyceum at Edinburgh before running Nottingham Playhouse, I'm interested in how you, perhaps having a background as an actor, you nurtured actors and you nurtured writers. So particularly Trevor Griffiths' Comedians, which went on to be a very great success on television. You first produced at the Nottingham Playhouse, didn't you?
I did. Trevor was a friend. I'd met him a few years before in Edinburgh, and I was auditioning at the Poetry Society in Earl's Court. I don't know if it still exists, but it was rather a wonderful place to go for a drink, particularly enjoyable if you saw poets arguing, which is often
while drunk.
While drunk, often a spectacle loved by poets. And I said to Trevor, I'd love you to write a play for Nottingham Playhouse. And he said, I have got an idea, and the idea is a night class for comedians, for stand-up comedians, working class comedians, club comedians, being taught by an old comic about ethical comedy. And I thought this sounded so weird. And I said to Trevor, that's a brilliant idea, do it.
This is 1975 you're talking about.
73.
73.
He then went away, wrote the play, which went on in early in 74. And I announced the play. I put it in a brochure, Comedians by Trevor Griffiths, before I'd read a word of it. So it was what I talked of at the time as a sort of kamikaze policy. And it tended to work, because several plays that I did in Nottingham, there was a play that Howard Benton and David Hare wrote called Brassneck, about civic corruption, in which there was a Masonic investiture, and the board of Nottingham Playhouse were very, very exercised about this scene and tried to persuade me to cut it. I said, but why? Why? What is the problem? And the problem was that they wouldn't expose their membership of Masonic order. Anyway, I did several plays that I just announced in the brochure before they appeared. And I somehow wish I'd continued that policy at the National Theatre, but you had to be very young and very reckless and not mind if you were fired to do that.
Well, we're going to have a look at some of the clips of the plays Play for Today's that you did, and Comedians was one of them. Tell us a bit about that transition to television then, and how you were absolutely at the centre of this golden age, I think it's fair to say, of TV plays.
Well, it was a bit of magic. I had run the Nottingham Playhouse for 5 years, doing a lot of new plays and working with a lot of young actors. And so I had some slight reputation for being in the vanguard of current theatre. And the BBC, in the shape of the head of plays, asked me if I would come and produce Play for Today. I think he was put up to it by a friend of mine called Margaret Matheson, who was a wonderful producer. And I think she had said, why don't you ask this guy, Richard, who is at Nottingham? So out of the blue, I was asked to go, having no experience of television at all, except appearing on it as an actor. Out of the blue, I was asked to go in 1978 to go to the BBC. And so in 1979, I started as producer of Play for Today. And my brief was to do, in the first season, 8 plays, they were called, of which 2 could be on film. And I thought that would be comparatively easy. It was incredibly difficult. And one of the reasons I did Comedians is because I simply couldn't find enough. You could do 2 on film, 6 in the studio on tape, multi-camera, and I could not get enough good writing to 6. The 2 plays that I did, one of them was, I thought the smart thing to do, since I know nothing about television, would be to employ some very, very good directors. So I employed John Mackenzie, who was later known for the what's it called, the Long Good Friday. Wonderful director, and Stephen Frears. And Stephen directed a film by Neville Smith called Long Distance Information.
Which Stephen's here.
Is Stephen here?
Stephen here.
Anyway, it's a lovely film. It's not shown because the film is about the death of Elvis, and it could be shown, get 2 showings on the BBC around the same time. It's never been repeated, because to get the rights of Elvis, I mean, the film itself probably cost about £200,000 to make, but Elvis's rights would probably be about £500 million. Anyway, sadly, it isn't shown, but unless you can see it, I don't think you can even see it on YouTube. But if you can, it's the most lovely small film. So I did those, and then I had the 6 studios, of which Comedians was one. And then in the second season, I commissioned a writer who'd I'd seen talking to Melvyn Bragg on the South Bank show, and he published a book of short stories, and his name was Ian McEwan. And I arranged to meet Ian, and it turned out he lived round the corner from us in Stockwell. So we became friends, and I commissioned a play, a film, which was called The Imitation Game. And to our fury, there was another, we think, incredibly inadequate film of the same title, starring Benedict Cumberbatch. The line, The Imitation Game, comes from Alan Turing, and it's about how you distinguish between artificial and real intelligence.
And it was your play was about Bletchley Park. Let's have a look at a set of clips then. These are all play for today's that Richard commissioned. So watching even just that small segment of your work back, a couple of things jump out at me is how you use actors and trust them. So there's an intimacy and a theatricality, but done appropriately for the screen. But also the range of class issues you touch on, and the sexism, like in The Imitation Game, the bullying dad of his daughter. Tell me a bit about the importance of tackling some of those themes. You know, it's really interesting you were doing that then.
Well, just to take your first point, I really like actors.
It shows.
And oddly, it's not universally true of directors that they really like actors. But and directors, I think, as a breed, as a tribe, tend to be rather self-aggrandizing. So they tend to, with films, it's the director's vision, and the film is always known as X's, X usually being a man, X's film, less so in the theatre where the writer has primacy. For me, it's always the actor whose soul is on show, the actor and the writer. And in all mediums, I think that is true. So that at least 50% of the director's job is encouraging a performance from an actor that illuminates the stage or the screen. The difference one of the differences with performing for film is that, of course, it only matters when the camera is running. So it doesn't matter if the 80 dud takes, as long as there's one take in which there's the vital spark of life. There's I think not far from his best film, but there's a film, Day for Night, Truffaut's Day for Night.
About filmmaking.
About filmmaking, where the director, Truffaut, lies in bed agonizing. He just keeps saying, let it live, let it live, let it live. And that's what however you achieve it, that's what you're thinking. Will this come alive? In the theatre, it's an absolutely linear process, day after day. And you sit there thinking sometimes, I'm watching a dead fish, that this creature is never going to come alive. And then gradually it comes alive, and you manage to get a group of actors to meld together, and then the whole is greater than the parts. With film, it's a wholly different process. It's just like assembling bits of the spiral of DNA, but you have to know, you have to have a sense that each moment, and you don't know how important it's going to be in a film. You often get it wrong and think, now this is the key moment in the film, and it turns out that actually that moment that you thought was so crucially important, you lavished so much care and attention on, was quite a sort of side issue. And that's why everything, the truism, every single shot in a film is the most important shot in the film.
And we're going to talk a bit more specifically about your films for the cinema screen a little bit later. But just while we're talking about Play for Today and your TV dramas, I am interested in the themes you chose to commission and direct. The fact that you do tackle working class representation at a time where I think it was, I know we'd had British social realism in the 60s, but I think it was still not that championed on television as you did.
No, there was, there was Ken Loach, there was Zed Cars, which Ken Loach was a director, John McGarth was a writer, there was Roy Battersby.
But in terms of your choices?
No, but I suppose in the 70s, I felt, as many of us on the left felt, that a revolution was on its way. I mean, I know it seems ridiculous, but this is the way we talked. The revolution came, of course, in the shape of Margaret Thatcher. That's how much we were prescient. So when in Comedians, what Jonathan's character represents is a violent revolution, hate fueling some sort of elimination of all the bourgeois values, and so it's not polemic. I mean, he is obviously criticised by the humanist, the moderate, the teacher, but that was the driving force, a belief in revolutionary possibility. Well, we got it 150% wrong.
Well, we're going to talk about that too shortly when we talk about the Ploughman's Lunch. I'm interested as well in, we start to see the beginning of that relationship with Ian McEwan, who you say you first encountered, sort of being interviewed by Melvyn Bragg, and wrote you screenplays, not just for The Imitation Game, but the Children Act and the Ploughman's Lunch. Tell me a bit about your relationship with writers, because Alan Bennett as well you've worked with, Trevor Griffiths also wrote Country, which I think he regards as the high point, or he regarded as the high point of his writing career, and that, we should say, is on BBC iPlayer.
Well, just as I really like actors, or I really like good actors, because good actors by definition are very bright. They tend to be witty, they tend to be clever, but not necessarily intellectually clever. They're just quick, and I like sort of wit in the broadest sense. And writers, I just like writers. I have a lot of friends who are writers, and I wouldn't say I envy them, but I do. I envy them because it's a very lonely business being a writer, and if you're good at it, and particularly if you're writing for performance, it's very easy to get knocked back. And in the theatre, if you write a play, you're very, very exposed, and you can be knocked over quite easily. But I think it's because the writers are the people who are the kernel, the seed of whatever happens. I mean, for whatever greatness of directing and art direction and all the things that appear on a screen. In the end, I mean, I saw Conclave last night, which is beautifully made, wonderful art direction, wonderful costumes, wonderful photography. But it actually is all because Robert Harris sat down and wrote a book. He's terribly smart at getting ideas for novels, and he keeps, does a new novel every 2 or 3 years. So it's his film, but it's, it wouldn't exist without the writer. So that's really why I revere writers, and I like their company. Yeah.
Yeah, it shows, and also I think it's interesting how there's a sense of real naturalism in the storytelling that you then put on screen based on their writing. The dialogue, the characterization feels very real. I want to talk a bit about the transition from Play for Today to the TV film, which became quite a format in the 80s, and this is the decade in which Channel 4 is launched in 1982, has a huge impact in original drama and long-form storytelling, fictional storytelling on TV. So there's the Screen 1 strand on BBC One, Screen 2. Give us a little insight into what it opened up for you as a film director when that culture began to change and filter through.
I should have said about one of the odd things about Play for Today. Mm-hmm. Play for Today was on Thursday nights at 9:25 after the 9 o'clock news. There were generally 75 minutes, 75 maximum 90 minutes. The brief of Play for Today was it had to be contemporary and, if possible, controversial. So it's completely impossible to imagine today a world in which a television commissioner says contemporary and controversial. Let's bring it on. Except, of course, the Post Office film, which has turned everything on its head. Anyway, I think Screen 1 and Screen 2 really was a retreat from that brief.
Interesting.
And then Film 4 arrived, or Channel 4 arrived. There was this brilliant guy who was recruited from BBC Birmingham, who'd been producing films, a man called David Rose. And he commissioned some really exciting films. And we were lucky enough, when I say we, a group of us formed a production company. And there were 6 of us, and we formed a production company to make films for Channel 4. And we did do a few. And the first one was The Ploughman's Lunch. We were incredibly innocent. I mean, so innocent that I remember Ian writing the script and saying, I'm sure, I've heard that there are companies that will pay to read the script. And I said, Ian, nobody's going to pay to read a script. He said, no, we should just go out there. And I sort of half believed that was possible. I mean, of course, it's complete fantasy. Anyway, David Rose was very keen on it, and we got commissioned to make the film. I think the budget was, by today's standards, completely laughable. I think it was probably around, Matt Scott may be here, who's the producer, around $1 million?
I think
£500,000. Okay. We were spoiled. £500,000 to make a feature film. And if I have a regret about it, it's that I particularly like the last 10 minutes of the film, which is sort of guerrilla filming.
Yeah, we should say you went to the Tory party conference that
year.
We
went in, the production manager had a friend who was in the press office of the Tory party and got us passes in there. And we went in with a crew, I think there was just one camera. So there was the cameraman and the actors, Jonathan Pryce and Tim Curry.
It's great.
We went onto the floor, and of course all the delegates thought that we were a friendly crew making a documentary about the Tory party. So they were these, nice women from the shires saying, would you like, come here, I think you could get a better angle of the Prime Minister
Yeah, and
from
also
here.
Michael Heseltine with his amazing hair was making a speech during one of the scenes that you shot.
And then we had Jonathan just walking onto the floor so he passed Michael Heseltine making a speech, and then Jonathan walking round. Took some nerve to do on Jonathan's part, just looking around as if there was somebody he needed to talk to. So I wish there had been more of that guerrilla spirit in the film, because in a way I think it's quite formal, but the issues of the film, the betrayal and bad faith and the parallel of Suez with the Falklands, I think was very strong.
I rewatched it. I watched it for the first time all the way through this morning, and it's amazing how much resonance it has for the politics of today. It's set in a Britain where, partly he's a journalist at the BBC. He knows he has a lot of power, and he's sucked into a version of news telling which ignores things which are inconvenient. So the Green and Common women are trying to get his attention.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's really interesting, and the sort of power of the right and the power of a certain kind of nostalgia, which anticipates things like take back control by decades. Why don't we have a look at this section and we can talk about all of them. So these are three TV films that you made. The Ploughman's Lunch from 1983, The Insurance Man, written by Alan Bennett from 1986 with a very young Daniel Day-Lewis, and Tumbledown, 1988, also revisiting the Falklands War with a young Colin Firth. Let's have a look. Richard, it is very moving, even watching that short clip of Tumbledown. And you hadn't seen it since, had you? Have you seen it much?
I saw it once. Tumbledown was 87. I have seen it once, in about 10 years after.
It holds up very
well.
No,
20 years after the Falklands, which was 2002.
Yes.
It was, I thought, very powerful, and particularly powerful because we had been, the Ministry of Defence and the Home Office tried to get the film stopped. This was before we shot a foot of it. Michael Grade and Bill Cotton, who were effectively running British television, were very, very keen to get it made. It had to be referred up, which is a familiar BBC expression, referred. And it was referred up, this film about a boy being shot in the head in the Falklands War, referred up to the chairman of the BBC governors, who at that time was a man who was later much ridiculed, called Marmaduke Hussey. Marmaduke Hussey had lost a leg at Monte Cassino. He was in a Guards regiment. The boy in Falklands was in Scots Guards. He had lost a leg. And he said, this film should be made. This film has got it right about soldiering. So whenever Marmaduke Hussey is now this go-to figure for, the decline of the BBC. But I think, well, hats off to Marmaduke Hussey, because that film wouldn't have been made without it. And, I mean, it didn't. When we decided to make it, the Guards tailors who had been making uniforms for the Guards for 200 years refused to make the uniforms for the film.
Really?
Yeah, there was a lot of sniping, and there were, endless questions in Parliament. How dare the BBC defame our boys in the Falklands with this film? All before it was made. And then I remember when we were shooting it, one of the crew came up and showed me a front page of the Daily Mail. And I had made a film about Tony Harrison's poem, V, which is about the versuses of life. And it said, in huge block capitals, fury over TV poem. And that, and then it said, by the director who is currently making the disgraceful film about our boys in the Falklands. Anyway, it was heavy duty. When the film was shown, and the first public showing of it was here at the NFT, and there was a packed audience. The film went down very well, and there were questions afterwards. And one person said, you made this film for the BBC. The BBC is supposed to be unbiased. So what do you think? Is this film biased? And I said, of course it's biased. It's about war. It's not going to be recommending war. It's biased, yes. I passionately feel that war is wrong and we should avoid war if possible. Next day, Daily Telegraph. BBC bias. Director admits BBC bias. Anyway, it was wonderful to make. We had a platoon of actual paras who were moonlighting, and they'd all been in the Falklands. And we were staying in Fishguard, and we were filming in the Brecon Beacons. And they all got violently drunk every single night. And we were there for 16 days. And there are 16 pubs in Fishguard, and they got banned from each pub every night. And we were filming up mountains, and they used to come up with their full kit, and you'd see them, vomiting, all with terrible hangovers, and then they'd go into action.
The show must go on.
The show. Anyway, it was quite something making, and Colin was brilliant. There was one other actor who I interviewed for the part, who had just come down from Oxford, and his name was Hugh Grant.
You were going to say
Yeah.
that.
Yep.
Oh, so interesting, so interesting. The Insurance Man, which you saw a clip of as well, this kind of Kafka-esque world, even in a short clip, we get a sense of a very rich visual evocation. There's a lot of machinery, there's a
Yes.
machine to do everything. Tell me a bit about that collaboration with Alan and with Daniel Day-Lewis.
Well, I knew Alan, but not well. And then one day, I discovered an A4 envelope on my doormat. And Alan had biked down from Camden Town to Stockwell, where I was then living, and delivered this script, which had a little note in Alan's beautiful calligraphic handwriting, saying, I don't know if you can make anything of this. And this was the script of The Insurance Man, and it was typed on an old-fashioned typewriter, and it had full of corrections and crossings out. And it was this amazing story of The Insurance Man, of Kafka, and it was such a gift. And I think Alan does this with all his writing. He writes something and he's never quite sure how it's going to work, and then hands over, it's always these days to Nick Heitner, and it was me, and I felt a bit like, is it Moley who introduces Badger to Ratty? But I introduced Nick Heitner to Alan, and it was love at first sight. And so I was sort of stayed on the riverbank. Anyway, this wonderful script, and then we cast. We saw a lot of people. I remember Ben Elton was one of them, but Daniel, who I knew, I'd worked with a couple of times in the theatre, and I think that was the first time when we were filming. we were staying in the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool, and we were filming. That whole set was on the floor of St George's Hall in Liverpool, this enormous late Victorian hall where we built our set. And I was in the lift one morning going down to breakfast, and I found I was sharing the lift with Franz Kafka. And it was Dan, but he was already in his costume. And I said, "Hi, Dan." And he spoke to me as Kafka. He said, and that was my first intimation that Dan's working method had shifted to sort of total embodiment of the character.
Yeah, we won't go into it now, but you may have seen Brian Cox has done an interview where he's not keen on method acting.
Yes, Dan's it's not quite method acting. It's sort of complete embodiment.
Right.
I mean, he has to become the character and has to live as the character. And sometimes it's been quite difficult. The character in Gangs of New York was a psychopathic killer. So, but you know, there've been. I called him up once at a New York hotel, and he was doing The Age of Innocence. So he was that character. Spoke to a very, very charming character who was, you know, American upper class. So. Anyway, he's a brilliant actor.
He is.
Lovely
Fantastic. I'm interested then in having made these wonderful feature-length films that were created for television, working for cinema. And I'm interested in how, even as a director as experienced as you were, did it feel significantly different when you stepped into directing for the big screen for the first time?
Well, Plumber's Lunch was exactly like directing a television, except we were filming on 35mm. So, you know, I was used to a 16mm camera, which is, you know, very light and small, and in those days, the 35mm cameras were bigger than they are nowadays. And so that was sort of slightly slowed things down, but I wasn't aware of that, you know, making for the big screen.
Budgets were
Well, I
also
was
different
with,
too, weren't
sorry,
they?
I mean, that was tiny budget, but I suppose the first film that, Iris was the first sort of feature where a lot was at stake, and there was a star cast, and Harvey Weinstein was distributing it, a man who should be condemned for many reasons to the bottom rung of hell. But so it was for an international audience. The way it had come about was I was doing a play with Judi in New York, Amy's View, and she had just won the Oscar. Literally, it was on the day after she'd flown back from Los Angeles, and we were rehearsing. We went out at the street, and she stopped the traffic. There were people going, "Judi, Judi, hey, Judi," because she just won the Oscar.
Was that for Shakespeare in Love?
Shakespeare, yeah. And we went to a diner, and I said, what are you doing next? She said, "I've been asked to play Iris Murdoch, and based on John Bailey's memoirs." And I said, have you got a director? And she said, "No, there's this guy called John Calley." Now, John Calley ran Columbia Pictures and Sony, and his best friend was Mike Nichols. And Mike was a friend of mine. And John Calley, Mike said to John Calley, "I don't want to direct it. You should get Richard to direct it." And he'd read a memoir of my mother who had Alzheimer's. And that's how I came to do it with John Calley. John Calley gave me the script. He said, we're not going to put money into it, but I'm not going to charge you anything for the rights. We'll pay the rights. So we started, and we had Judi Dench, Jim Broadbent, Kate Winslet, and Hugh Bonneville, but we could only raise £5 million to make the film. And am I right? I think Robert's here. 5? Yeah. We could only raise 5 million with those people. And so we all took a cut. So all the above the line, producers, director, writer, actually I was co-writer with Charles Wood, we all took a cut, and that's how it got made. And then it did very, very well, but because it was distributed by Harvey Weinstein, nobody got any money from it. There were no back-end payments, although it cost, 5 million to make and took about 30 million, but so we never saw.
And I know that obviously you'll talk more about that in the introduction to the screening, which is coming up later. We've got a set of clips from 3 of your acclaimed feature films. So why don't we have a look at them, and we could talk a bit more about the ideas. So we're going to have a look at clips from Stage Beauty, Notes on a Scandal, and The Children Act. There's a certain kind of new power to seeing the Children Act now in the light of all the discussions going on around his sister dying. It was obviously, again, based on a Ian McEwan book, wasn't it? And a Jehovah's Witness background where blood transfusions are against their faith. I don't know just seeing those again, it's striking how there is that intimacy always in your work with how you pick the actors, how you give them the space on screen, how you're not afraid to linger on a face and the silence.
Yeah, I think silence is something that can be very, very powerful in cinema, in a way that in theatre, it's really not. It's awkward if the molecules in the air aren't being charged by speech. And I like silence. I like also lack of music sometimes in film. I think there's so often that a score is used as a sort of, like kind of latex covering the feeling, and then
prodding you, isn't it?
Prodding you and saying you've got to feel, you've got to. I think the most egregious use of film music is in Platoon, where that really, really brilliant, George, tell me, the Adagio, composer Barber, it's Barber's Adagio, is used, and over a voiceover of how, the suffering of American soldiers. And you've just seen this film of this country, Vietnamese, being destroyed by the bestial Americans, and they're playing Barber's Adagio, which is, it's absolutely heartrending, and it's an amazing piece of music, which is a sort of automatic go-to, feel, let the tears pour, but it's used in such a dishonest way.
I love the way you're talking to you. You often refer to, you don't refer to the positives of your work, you refer to what you try not to do. And I think there's the whole career, parallel career in director's commentaries where Richard Eyre tells you what is wrong with this film. But no, which is really well meant. It's really interesting because in your own work, you just do it. And I think talking to you, you almost deflect from discussing how fine your skills are and how they've honed. I'm also interested because you went back to run the National Theatre for many years, having done all that TV work before then embarking on feature films. And you seem to straddle the theatrical and the cinematic with such ease.
Yeah, well, I didn't make a film for 10 years because I went to the National, and it was just when Tumbledown came out, and there was a Tory government, and they were very, very exercised. So they fired, in those days, the chair of the National Theatre Board was appointed directly by the government, had to be approved by the Queen. And there was a man called Max Rain who'd been the chair for 25 years. And they sacked him, and they put in their person who they thought would, and she was explicitly told to sort out the pinkos at the National Theatre. However, they made a big mistake because they appointed Mary Soames, who is Churchill's youngest daughter. Mary fell in love with the National Theatre from the first day and was wonderful, adored by everyone in the theatre. And it was her passion. She just thought it was great. She thought the collective enterprise was great. And she was a wonderful critic. She would always say, "Oh, Richard, I don't know about this, but," and would be always on the money. And so, yes, I was there for that. And I had, the first 18 months was horrible. Really, really, really depressing. And then the next 7 or 8 years, I loved it.
Can you tell us briefly why the first 18 months
Yes,
was so tough?
I can, because the National Theatre had moved from the young Vic, from the old Vic, which was like a sort of conventional theatre, and theatres are always sort of pyramid shape. Mm-hmm. You know, that you have a director and then a few managers, you know, the actors and the crew. The National Theatre, for I don't know what reasons, had been organised when they moved to, because there were 3 auditoriums, organised like a film studio. So each department had a separate budget. And so you had to negotiate with all these separate departments.
So it's almost like you had your big budget blockbuster in the Olivier and then your middle budget one in the second and your indie in the
baffling
Potterslow.
thing was that there were no budgets. There were no pro forma budgets. And I said, you know, where are the budget? We sit down and we make a budget. They said, we don't do it that way. And so instead of saying, do we need music for this production? You would be told, oh, you can have 7 musicians in the Olivier, 4 in the Littleton, 2 in the Cottesloe. I said, no, we start from a point of 0 where you say, do you need music? They say, we don't do it that way. And I had these terrible, terrible rows. And incidentally, the guy who was a sweet man, actually, who was head of finance, had been head of finance at British Lion. So he'd come from a film studio. And then also, Peter Hall had got in as a sort of production manager, managing the move, somebody who had never worked in theatre, but was a very experienced film producer. So I had to sort of dismantle all of that and get back to making a theatre run like a theatre.
That's interesting. In a way, the reason I asked is because you've had an experience of almost, like you say, almost like running a film studio, and you've seen making screen work and theatre work from all sides, including the sort of the finance side of being in charge. We might come back to talk a bit about how making films now works in the era of streaming, but given that we've moved on to talk about theatre, you have also made such a mark with the theatre that you've put on screen. And I wanted to talk a bit about that. You mentioned multi-camera filming, and that was something, I mean, the BFI screened it a lot, these dramas that were shot almost as live performances after days of rehearsal. You have multi-cameras, and you know, the great Shakespeare's were done that way, many other dramas have been done that way.
Comedians was done that way.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So the performance strand that you worked on at the BBC in the 90s, that seemed to be one of the last big moments for doing the classics on television. Tell me a bit about your approach to and your experience of putting theatre on stage, on screen rather,
well,
sorry.
I've done The Dresser and King Lear were more like film. I mean, they felt more like making feature films. But the one that I did for TV was the suggestion of the producer, Ant Scott, who said, why don't we do The Cherry Orchard for television with Judi Dench? And I said, I love that play, which I think is the best play of the 20th century.
Really?
Yeah, and I think because it has, I think it's 12 characters, and somehow each character represents a sector of society, but you never think there's any hint of stereotype in the whole play. And when the character, when he says, all Russia is our orchard, and you think, this play, how magnificent is it to be able to say in a play, all Russia is our orchard, and get that in the play, the sense that you are looking at Russia from the top to the bottom of society. Anyway, Anne suggested we did a version that I'd done at Nottingham, which Trevor Griffiths had done a version, which was very, very good and felt very, very fresh, and that we cast Judi Dench as Raniewski, which was wonderful. And then I said, but I couldn't face doing this with multi-camera. I just couldn't, because you can't light properly. And I had worked with a cameraman who was also chief cameraman on Comedians, and I said, how would you feel about doing this in the studio with just one camera, or occasionally we might have two cameras if we're shooting close-ups, you know, across in a dialogue. And he said, oh, we'll have a go in the lighting direct. And that's what we did. And it does actually look beautiful. And then I decided that there's the aristocrats and there's the working class peasants, serfs. And so I had the aristocrats were English and the non-aristocrats were Scottish. So you've got Billy Paston playing Leparkin, who is just breathtakingly good. And it was wonderful. I mean, it was really skin of our teeth getting it made. And I think we had 5 days to shoot, you know, so we were shooting at least 20 minutes a day. And it was
different approach, isn't it?
Yeah, but it looked, I was really thrilled with it. Yeah.
Well, we've got another little clip set, which is of some of your classics on TV and film, and they show that range of approach. It's not, like you say, it's not multi-camera necessarily, it's often quite cinematic. So let's have a look and then we'll talk some more. We've got The Cherry Orchard from 1981, we've got The Hollow Crown, Henry IV, Part 2 from 2012, and we've got Lear from 2018. They're so magnificent. Just the line readings that they're giving. I mean, how much are you going through with the actors and helping them? Like that moment in The Hollow Crown where the delivery of Tom Hiddleston's line where he's suddenly turning to talk to Falstaff very intimately rather than declaiming. Just, it's done so lightly. It's done so elegantly.
Well, I like rehearsing.
Yeah.
So for all those, you know, the rehearsals, so I don't like going on a film set without having rehearsed or read through in a room. I mean, what absolutely breaks my heart every time I see that Florence Pugh, who has become a sort of megastar since then. I think that was Florence's second or third job, but she'd never done Shakespeare. And she suddenly found herself surrounded by people like Emma Thompson and Emily Watson, Jim Broadbent, Tony Hopkins, who had all done masses of Shakespeare, and she just has a sort of perfect instinct. Yeah. And she's absolutely beautiful in that scene. But Tony, I mean, he's just like a great, I mean, it's like Judi, he's just like a great musician. So very, very rarely would I be saying, Tony, just don't think that's right. I might be saying, could you take that down a bit, or could you pull that up, or could you pull that word out? But on the whole, we would have talked through everything. I mean, we would have talked through everything before we shot the film.
No, just the approach shows up. So the one thing I've been dying to ask, though, when Hollow Crown went out, I remember because it was the Olympic year and it was a big commission by BBC Arts to celebrate culture in the year of the Olympics. And the night that it was supposed to run, I was all geared up to watch it, and Wimbledon was on. And they went, oh, the Hollow Crown will not be shown tonight because there's a match overrunning. It'll be shown at a future date. And I thought, what? And then, so about 20 minutes later, they went, oh, actually, it is going to be shown. And obviously someone had been ringing. What the hell went on that night?
I have absolutely no idea, because nobody got in touch with me, and I'd settled down to watch TV. I had loved doing that, the Henry IV Part 1 and 2. It was such a fabulous opportunity. I love those plays, and it did feel a real slap in the face.
It felt like arts could just be pushed to the side.
I did think the BBC, whoever made that decision, should be ashamed of themselves. It's just completely wrong and rude, and confirmed my feeling that there's no one at the top of the BBC who thinks what I think is that the BBC is the most important cultural organisation in the world.
Yes.
And they don't see that. They think it's all news and current affairs and, we're the big boys. The BBC, as far as most of the country, if you want current affairs, I would watch Channel 4 News or listen to the radio, but you don't go to the BBC for television for news because, there's a stranglehold. But I just find the lack of pride and the lack of understanding at the BBC of what they have as a cultural capital. And, the politicians aren't interested because they're only interested in whether they get a bad reputation or people talk badly on TV. I was on the board of governors of the BBC for 9 years, so I've seen it from all directions. I worked for BBC from 1979, and I'm appalled by how much it's changed, because in those days you had responsibility, and there was no channel controller saying, when we were doing Tumbledown, saying, well, you've got to cast X or Y, and you were just trusted to get on with it because they trusted the chain of command.
Yeah.
Now it's like old-fashioned Hollywood. They sit there, people with absolutely no experience of producing drama or comedy. They're making decisions that have huge influence.
Interesting. About to open up to questions from all of you. One other thing I wanted to ask is, we're in the era of streaming, which has, in theory, put a lot more money and a lot more commissioning bodies into the picture for people who are making films and pitching screenplays. But I wonder what your view is on how that's changing the landscape of making original stories.
I think it's become more difficult to make.
Really?
I'm trying to make a film written by Rose Tremaine called The Housekeeper. And it's about Daphne du Maurier, and it's a sort of Rebecca origin story. There's a Mrs. Danvers character who's going to be played by Uma Thurman. There's the Lord of the Manor, who's going to be played by Tony Hopkins. And there's Daphne du Maurier, who is Phoebe Dynevor. And we're having trouble raising money for it. It's an outstanding script, outstanding crew, and it's very, very difficult.
The algorithms presumably don't really understand it.
It's just, no, because it's quite unusual, doesn't fit into any sort of particular genre, and there's no police procedural, and because it's period, it's pretty hard to make it cheaply, because you've got period costumes, period locations, which, puts quite a premium on the budget.
Is it a coincidence that while you've done very successful shows, things like Guys and Dolls, there is something about your connection to British storytelling, stories about Britain and British characters?
Well, I've always been in love with Americana. From the days I used to read Marvel comics, and loved everything American, but at the same time, I've always detested the way that we've been colonized by. I mean, our language is just constantly changed by Americanisms.
Another one I really hate is the way that when people swear, they don't put their two fingers up like they should, like British swearing.
Oh, I know.
They do the American finger.
What the finger? I know.
I'm not going to do it. No.
Yeah. No. No, it's ridiculous, and people, use terms from baseball.
Oh, I know.
That we don't even play baseball in this country.
No, it's called rounders anyway.
Yeah.
Right. There'll be an availability.
Well, I suppose, I think Laughter House is quite a charming film that in fact won an award at the Venice Film Festival. I think Loose Connections is just not very good.
You didn't veto it, did you?
No, it was never discussed,
Okay.
but I think perfectly reasonably not being exhumed.
Ooh, good.
The first question, James Horner, because one of the producers, Scott Rudin, said we should get, he said you should get a really high-powered composer, and James had just done Titanic, so he was about as high-powered as they come. Scott Rudin persuaded Sony Classics, the record label, to pay for the score. And they said, we will pay for it if James writes a score that has a very strong violin part, because we want Joshua Bell. We've just taken on Joshua Bell as one of our star performers. So it was financed by, we could never afford, we didn't have any money in the budget for a score. So Sony Classical, which ironically was then run by a man who later became a very good friend of mine, Peter Gelb, who ran the Met Opera in New York, where I've done 4 productions for the Met. So that's how that came about. The answer to how is theatre? I honestly don't know. I saw a good production. I've seen 2 enjoyable productions recently. I saw Oedipus, which I thought it's the first time I've seen that play engage me, and I know I'm supposed to be engaged by this story, but I thought Rob Icke's version was very strong, and Leslie Manville and Mark Strong were terrific in it. And I saw a dramatisation of Hanif Qureshi's The Buddha of Suburbia.
The Emma Rice production for the RSC.
Yeah, which is a sort of glorified panto, but it's full of energy and wit, and has Hanif's bite to it. So if you just take those, I'd say, well, theatre's very healthy. But I know that you've got to have a star to get anything on in the theatre these days. But I can't talk any further. I can't give you a sort of Olympian view of the theatre. I think John Osborne was asked, says, is the theatre dying? He said, the theatre is always dying. And you know, it's life. There are cycles. It dies. I'll give you a good example. In the early 90s, you would have said that new writing in the US was dead. A friend of mine who ran a theatre in Los Angeles sent me a script. It was a very thick script, 2 plays. I was supposed to go to Prague, where my production of King Lear was playing, my production of Richard III was playing at the theatre in Prague, and I was supposed to meet Havel. However, there was a snowstorm, so there was no traffic out of Heathrow. So I read these 2 plays, and by page 3, I thought, I just have to do. These are so brilliant. And that was Tony Kushner's Angels in America, which is why that went on at the National Theatre years before a production in New York. Well, I think editors are absolutely essential. I mean, editors can't make a film that hasn't been shot, but they can construct a film out of material which can have almost an infinite variety of shapes and meanings. I've known some very brilliant editors, and I think they're in some ways as important as the writer and the director. I mean, indispensable figures. And it's not just the technical thing of, you know, how you put pieces of film together and how you cut a scene and change the emphasis of a scene. It's editing in the sense of a literary editor taking a view of what is this about? And you have to have a view of what you're doing before you can edit. When I went to the BBC in 1979, I went on a course that was a sort of introduction to BBC producers course. It was actually really good because we had talks in presentation, in commissioning, in budgets and photography, and there was the editor. An editor came in and gave us a practical job, an exercise. We had about 5 minutes of film to cut together, and we had 3 hours to do it. We had a Steenbeck, and you know, we were sticking it together like this. But you looked at the material, and it was about 2 men who threw a ball at each other, and there was a woman sitting on the bench, and they threw the ball to her, and she threw it there. So I thought, oh, this technical exercise of how you time throwing the ball and who throws the ball when. It was in the last half hour, I realized that the exercise was about content, was about editing, and there was probably a maximum 7 minutes, 7 seconds material that was worth showing. And my cut lasted about, because I didn't have time to make it short enough, lasted about 20 seconds. And the editor's cut lasted 5 seconds. And it was, because that's all the content there was, somebody throwing a ball of no interest whatsoever. So that really taught me that it's, in the end, it's content, it's rather than style that's the crucial importance.